It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
So last week, we saw a battle where Israel, they fought against Ammon, who had hired the Syrians, where Joab and Israel's army, they were surrounded on both sides, where both enemies were driven back and fled. Then Joab, he gathered Israel's whole army and he chased after the Syrians, and they defeated them, leaving the nation of Ammon to fight against on another day. And here in chapter 11, it's that day, and it's springtime, the customary time for kings to go out to war. And that's because the winter months, they were too cold and it rained a lot. But in the spring, the crops, they would have already been planted and they would be growing. And so the men, they wouldn't be needed as much to work out in the fields. And in these days, it was the kings who led their armies into battle. And though Joab was David's commander in the field, it's assumed that David led that last battle with Ammon, because that's what kings were called to do. And it's like we saw with King Saul. They're always fighting with their men. And so David, he should have went to this battle, but we're told that they had already been defeated, that the people of Ammon were destroyed. And now Israel is laying siege to Rabbah, which is the capital city of Ammon. So here, Israel's army is encamped all around the city, and they're trying to starve them out. And so they're waiting for their armies to come out to them. And when they do that, they have all these little battles. But Ammon was basically defeated. So this was a mop-up operation, something that Joab, that he could handle on his own. And though David doesn't go out to battle, he will be fighting a different kind of battle, a battle that's inside of him, a battle of temptation that he will lose. And so with everyone gone, it's relatively quiet in Jerusalem. And so David, he takes a late afternoon nap. And it wasn't uncommon to take a nap in the hottest part of the day. And then toward evening, he gets up. And before the sun sets, he goes to the roof where it's cooler, where the evening wind would be starting to blow. And it says he walked on the roof. And where that word walked here in Hebrew, it means that he paced back and forth. And the roofs in Israel, they were part of the living quarters. So it's like a patio. And it's still that way today in Israel. And David, he sees this woman bathing. And the Bible tells us that this woman is beautiful. And when the Bible calls a woman beautiful, she really is. Because the Bible doesn't call every woman beautiful. In fact, it calls very few women beautiful. And I don't know who you think is beautiful, but this woman is Hollywood beautiful. She's an Angelina Jolie or someone of great, astounding beauty. And she's bathing. So she's naked, and David seeing her naked is not a sin, because David couldn't help that. But it says the woman was very beautiful to behold, and David did, and he beheld her, and he beheld her way too long, and he made no attempt to turn away to give the woman her modesty, where he chose to stay and watch and to lust. Because David has a lust problem, and he's always had a problem with beautiful women, and it didn't start here. It started way back by not obeying God's laws for marriage, where David multiplied wives, and knowingly knowing that he was disobeying God's written law. not just for men, but for kings, because having multiple wives was never a plan that God had for marriage. And David here, being around 50 years old, he has at a minimum at least 6 wives, but he probably had many more, especially if we were to include his concubines. And we just read how he also inherited Saul's wives. And concubines, they were second-class wives. So they were only there for David's pleasure. So these would be the women of David's harem. But now David, he has been moved by the beauty of this woman. And so he inquires of who she is, and he sends his messengers to find out. And of those that David sent, one comes back and he says, "Is this not Bathsheba?" And this is the only time in this whole chapter where the woman Bathsheba is called by her name. And here we have to ask the obvious, because it can't be just me. Of course she's Bathsheba. She's on the roof taking a bath. What else could her name be? You have the Queen of Sheba because she's a queen. This is Bathsheba because she takes baths on rooftops. And before this incident, you kind of wonder, was she only just known as Sheba? But yes, the messenger says, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam?" And Eliam, he was one of David's mighty men. And so he's an elite warrior. And you will find Eliam mentioned in 2 Samuel 23-24 as one of the 30 mighty men. And Eliam was also the son of David's good friend, who was the wisest of all his counselors, Ahithophel, who had this reputation of being as wise as God. And so you have Ahithophel, who was also Bathsheba's grandfather, and he's going to come up later. So you're going to want to kind of keep this in the back of your mind. And then that messenger tells David that she's the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And so this should have ended David's inquiry, because Bathsheba is a married woman. And she's not only married, but she's married to another one of David's mighty men, because Uriah the Hittite was also an elite warrior, also mentioned in 2 Samuel 23. And Uriah being a Hittite, it means that Uriah is not a Jew. He's a Hittite that's become a convert sometime in his life, where the name Uriah, it means "My light is Yahweh," or else it means the flame of God. And even with Bathsheba being the wife of his friend, it didn't stop him, because David, he had already committed adultery with her in his mind. Where in David's mind, he had already taken her, because all adulteries are committed in the mind before they're ever acted out physically. So it's never just an accident or just a mistake or, well, it just happened. It's always planned, where it's always been thought over and over again, with the idea being played out in the heart until the thought has an opportunity to be acted out. And so David, he sent for her, and she came to him. And Bathsheba, she probably didn't have much of a choice, because if the king sends for you, you have to go. And the Bible, it never says a bad word against Bathsheba. We're never told that Bathsheba sinned, but it also doesn't mean she didn't. But the Bible clearly puts the responsibility of this sin squarely on David, as it should be. But people will point out, which is true, that Bathsheba, that she knew where she lived. She knew that she lived next door to the king's palace, and she would have known that David would have been able to see her from his rooftop. But we don't know if she knew he was looking, and her husband isn't home, and he's been gone for months, and he's not expected anytime soon. And he's a soldier who's in battle, so he may never come home at all. But it doesn't mean that she thought all this. And the roof, to me, it would have seemed like a reasonable place to take a bath, because you wouldn't take it in the living room. I don't think so. And so Bathsheba, she's invited to the palace. And what an honor that must have felt like. It was like a Cinderella story. And then David, he lays with her. And there's no reason to believe that this was forced. You can't get that out of the text. And so we don't assume it. And we're told that Bathsheba came to David, that she was cleansed of her impurity, meaning Bathsheba wasn't pregnant when she came. She had just finished her monthly cycle. And we don't know how Bathsheba felt about this encounter. She may have been caught up with this infatuation because he's the king, infatuated with his power, but she didn't love David. And we know that David, he didn't love Bathsheba because how could he? He didn't even know her name. He doesn't know her. This was just temptation and lust, and it was just an act of adultery. There was no love in this. And so Bathsheba, she sneaks off in the middle of the night to go to her home. And if everyone keeps quiet, no one will ever know. It'll be as if it never happened, and we'll just all go on with our lives. And that's how it seemed for the next month or two. It would have seemed like David got away with his sin, where things were back to normal, where it may now just seem to be only a memory. But that's not true, because David didn't get away with anything here. And if you read Psalm 51, where David writes about this time, he says that his sin was ever before him. And then in Psalm 32, which is about this sin David committed with Bathsheba, David says, when he kept silent, his bones grew old through his groaning all day long. Or David says, for day and night, your hand was heavy on me. So David, he lived in regret and in guilt. And then one day, David, he gets this message from Bathsheba. I am with child, which are the only words of Bathsheba in this whole story. The only words David never wanted to hear. And with this message, I am with child, there's an appeal with it, an appeal for David to take the necessary steps to escape the consequences of their sin. Because in our culture, this wouldn't have been the end of the world. It would just be unfortunate. And in our culture, this stuff happens all the time, which is a shame. But in their world, it was the end of the world, because according to the law, an adulterer and an adulteress were to be put to death by stoning. And it was written in their law. It was in Leviticus 20:10. And hearing that Bathsheba was pregnant, David here, he had to make a choice. And David, he makes the wrong choice, because Bathsheba being pregnant with his child, it should have caused David to confess his sin and repent, and hoping in God's mercy, no matter what it cost him. But that's not what David chose. So instead of confessing and repenting, David does what most of us would do. He tries to hide his sin. And so he begins to conspire and to plot how to get away with his sin. And so David, he sends a message to Joab to send Uriah the Hittite back to the palace. Because if David can get Uriah to sleep with his wife, it's still early enough. No one will know whose child this is, because nobody would be able to keep track of the calendar that accurately. The baby, it could have arrived early. So David here, he's fine with deceiving his friend and letting the other man unknowingly raise his child from the adultery he committed with his wife. And he doesn't have a problem here also with Bathsheba having to live with this lie with her husband for the rest of her life, and allowing Uriah to believe that the child belonged to him. And so Uriah is called. And I would think it would seem strange to Uriah the Hittite that he would be called out of the middle of a battle to be the king's messenger boy, because he's a warrior, he's needed, he's a mighty man, and anyone can bring a message to the king. But he goes. David brings him into the palace. And you need to look at the question David asks Uriah, because there's absolutely no substance to them. David says, so Uriah, how's Joab doing? Well, what's Uriah going to say? He's going to say, well, he's fine. And how are the people doing? Well, they're real good. How is the war going? We're still winning. And the answers to David's question, they're not important. They're not even recorded because they don't mean anything to David, because David doesn't care anything about what Uriah is saying. He just needs him to get home to sleep with his wife to cover his sin. And David here, he doesn't think there's going to be any problem because Uriah, he's been away for months and his wife is knockout beautiful. And it's lawful for him because there's nothing wrong with Uriah having relations with his wife. In fact, he has the king's blessing because the king tells him to go home and wash his feet, meaning go home, Uriah, go relax, go be with your wife, because that's exactly what David would do if he was Uriah. In fact, that's exactly what David did. And so David sends Uriah home with a gift basket of all these wonderful foods for a romantic dinner and maybe with a little wine and a Barry White CD. But even though Uriah lived right next door, he didn't go home, but he slept out on David's porch with David's other servants at the palace. And we don't know if Uriah ever saw Bathsheba while in Jerusalem. But some commentators, they speculate that he did, and that he knew something was off, that things didn't seem quite right, that Uriah sensed something was different, as if it didn't smell right, a spiritual discernment where this one flesh relationship that they once had been broken. And some commentators, they speculate that Uriah heard some gossip from the palace servants, rumors about his wife. But that's not what it says here. Because when David asked Uriah, why did he go home? Because David, he was watching. Uriah's answer was honorable. Because we're at war, and I'm a soldier, and the ark is in a tent, and the whole army is in tents. All my comrades in arms. So I can't act like I'm on vacation and be with my wife, eating and drinking when none of them can. And so Uriah, he has so much more integrity than David, where David, he had to be very convicted because David, he had no problem sleeping with Uriah's wife with all these same things going on. And so David, he commands Uriah to stay another day. So there's no special reason here. It's just to give David this one last chance to get Uriah to lower his convictions, to get him home to sleep with his wife, to cover up his sin. And so David sets out to get Uriah drunk because he knows that people are willing to do things when they're drunk that they're not willing to do sober, that it's easy to lower your convictions when you're drunk. So Uriah, he had to drink because drinking with the king is compulsory. So let's have another toast. Cheers, cheers. And so David, while he's only taking these little sips of his wine, he's making sure Uriah's cup is always full. But Uriah here, he's a better man drunk than David is sober. And so Uriah, for the second night, he crawls off to sleep on David's porch. And you kind of wonder what Uriah is thinking. Was he thinking, I didn't know the king liked me this much to make me his drinking buddy? But what really disturbs me here is that we can see that Uriah, that he loves David and that he's very loyal to him and that he would do anything for his king, to even lay down his life in battle for him. And he's showing him this loyalty to David as David betrays him, where David, he comes to this conclusion, that Uriah has to die. So the next morning, we see David writing the orders to Joab to have Uriah murdered. And in this letter, David, he doesn't mince words. He's telling Joab, set Uriah up in the front of the hottest battle, and then retreat from him and abandon him there to be struck down and die. And so David is asking Joab in no uncertain terms to kill Uriah, but to make it look like an accident. And then David, he has the nerve to put this letter demanding Uriah's death in Uriah's own hands, knowing that this man is so loyal to him that he would never dream of opening the letter. And so you can picture David here blessing Uriah and kissing him on the cheeks, thanking him for coming and waving goodbye, like it says in Proverbs 27:6, where it says, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. Where this is so mafia. This is Judas Iscariot being betrayed with a kiss. So what happens to our hero, and what happened to him? What happened to David? The David that we loved, that we knew. Where is he? Where this almost makes you kind of miss King Saul, because King Saul, he acted wickedly, but I don't remember King Saul ever acting this wickedly, where some of us, we may even be sympathetic to the adultery that David committed. But who is this man who is willing to murder an innocent man, a friend, to cover up his sin? And I've met Christians who actually told me that they hate David, where they can't understand how David could ever be considered to be God's man, a man after God's own heart, being able to commit such a wicked crime. And we might think that we're not capable to commit anything like this. And I would like to think of myself that way, but it wouldn't be true. And you wouldn't know by looking at me, because we can all appear to be the most gentle, kindest, most civilized person in our community, who would never be the person who could ever commit such an act that would not only disgust the people in the church, but shock the vilest of sinners. But all you have to do is just ask Bath Rebecca. Or not that she's done anything like this, I know, but we're all capable of this. You got Bath Kirk here, and then you got Bath Salem, and we see it all the time in the news. We see rapists who murder their victims to cover up their sins. You have Epstein's pervert island, and then he's killed. The world is vile, and it's in our DNA. And I'm not going to say anything more, because some of us, we've done things and we have them in our hearts that God has already forgiven us of. But we have Joab here, and he receives the letter from Uriah's hand, ordering Uriah's death. And Joab, he must be looking at Uriah and wondering, why? Because he doesn't know. Because David must have a good reason for wanting Uriah's death. But Joab, he knows nothing about what's been happening back home in Jerusalem. But Joab, I don't think he would have had a problem doing David's dirty work, even if he did know.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and Your Neighborhood Church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,